The release of a new mainline Final Fantasy has always been a big event, with those linked with the newest generation of consoles setting the tone for the series going forward. This was especially true for Final Fantasy X, which pushed the series further in numerous areas, all while continuing the impressive streak of quality the series had become known for. But when it came time to move on from Final Fantasy X, senior figures such as Yoshinori Kitase felt that the story of Spira wasn't quite done, and explored the idea of expanding that tale even further. It led to the creation of Final Fantasy X-2, and as the series was famous for its standalone nature, it led to a lot of speculation in the build-up to its release as to what exactly the game would be about and where the story would go. In the end, Final Fantasy X-2 would end up being a very different experience from its predecessor, and it led to players voicing a wide range of opinions. But given how it went on to influence further expansions to mainline Final Fantasy games, it's safe to say that X-2 earned its place in the franchise's history, if only for its amazing gameplay. For today's video, we are going to dive pretty deep into some of the more intriguing nuances relating to Final Fantasy X-2, so be sure to subscribe if you haven't already for more high quality Final Fantasy content. And from some intriguing interactions with fans that influenced in-game content, through to some alternate versions of the game that ended up being canned, let's run through 7 Final Fantasy X-2 facts you probably didn't know, in our typical granular style. And we're going to kick things off with a fact relating to how the initial story they had planned ended up being completely different from the one we got within the final game. Every new entry into the Final Fantasy series strives to bring something different to the table. And for Final Fantasy X-2, the development team tried to make sure that mantra was maintained. But as they had never made a direct sequel before, there was a lot of speculation on how this new direction would turn out, and one of the major areas of focus was the story. When X-2 was revealed, we learnt that instead of the wholesale return of the main cast, we would instead revisit the land of Spira with a smaller party, focusing on just Yuna and Riku and their new companion called Pain. The decision to go with this cast was made quite early on in development, with Yoshinori Kitase stating that the development team wanted to take the series in a new direction, and that they had taken direct inspiration from both the Charlie's Angels reboot and Tomb Raider. However, what's not so well known is that the initial idea was that X-2 would be created as a prequel, focusing on a cast consisting of Braska, Auron, and Jecht. As Kitase explained in an interview with IGN, one of the reasons they decided to move away from this initial idea was that they felt it would have ended up being too much like a traditional role-playing game, which was something the team wanted to avoid. In addition, Motomo Toriyama, who stepped up as director, did not like the idea of having an all-male cast, nor did they have the scope to create an entirely new cast of characters. So, after it was decided that Yuna would be a good focal point, they believed it would be best to keep things simple, aligning her with her cousin Riku and Riku's friend and fellow Sphere Hunter Pain, who just happened to have a strong connection with the two people who would lead the new political factions. With the decision made about who would be the focal point, the team at Square attempted to figure out how they could best deliver the project to fans, and this didn't just relate to the storyline and the gameplay mechanics. Throughout the early 2000s, it would be hard not to see the influence that games like Pokemon had on the video games industry, and one of the most glaring examples was the notion of releasing multiple versions of the same game with slightly different story and aesthetic differences between each version. While it was true that in Japan, Final Fantasy games had had multiple releases thanks to the international versions, which came with added content and numerous quality of life and bug fixes, the series had never, at that point, released multiple versions of the same game at launch. It was therefore quite the surprise when, at an investors meeting in 2002, the news broke that Square was planning to expand the story of Final Fantasy X in the form of 2 separate spin-off titles. It was believed that these spin-off titles would have told different sides of the same story, a first for the series, but unfortunately not much is known about the actual details. The only thing we do know with a high degree of certainty is that one of the stories would have focused on Yuna, while the other would have focused on the story of Riku. These versions were obviously never released, so it's anyone's guess as to how the storytelling method would have played out, but it's still interesting to think about how well Riku would have been able to carry the weight of being the game's main protagonist. One of the standout parts of Final Fantasy X was its robust and fast-paced battle system, which was well received by both critics and fans alike. Developed by Tagatsuka Nakazawa, who had worked as a battle planner on Final Fantasy 7, 8, and 10, what has become known as the ATB Kai system amongst the fanbase was much quicker and more dynamic, while also integrating elements of the CTB system that was seen within Final Fantasy X. But what really made the system stand out was how it integrated jobs via the Dressphere system. Not only did this allow for the return of many classic jobs from the likes of Final Fantasy 3, 5, and Tactics, the Dressphere system also allowed for fluid and ever-changing combat scenarios, with an emphasis placed on finding the right combinations of jobs for any given battle. While standard Final Fantasy jobs like the White Mage, Black Mage, Thief, and Warrior made an appearance, there were also some jobs created that were a bit more unique for 10.2. Some standouts included the likes of Mascot and Lady Luck, but there were also some that didn't make the cut, such as a unique version of the Geomancer, and one for Yuna that featured what appeared to be a gunblade a la Squall from Final Fantasy VIII. For the international version of the game, which also came with the Last Mission expansion, Square Enix held a contest that allowed fans to submit Dressphere designs with the promise that one of them would appear within the game. Compared to the creations of the developers for the initial game, this contest saw even more outlandish designs submitted, including one which was mildly prophetic when thinking about how Eidolons would end up working in Final Fantasy XIII, as it showed Yuna transforming into a train. The winner of this contest was an 8-year-old fan from Japan, and their design was for that of the Festivalist, a job featuring a different ability for each of the main cast, along with auto abilities focused on buffing the party. Beating out all of the other submissions, the visual design, which included costumes for Yuna, Riku, and Pain, was taken by the team at Square Enix and recreated down to even the most minute of details, which you have to say shows an incredible level of dedication for the fanbase. Now, the Final Fantasy series has a long history of being self-referential, with many mainline titles hiding Easter eggs and allusions to previous entries. Final Fantasy X-2 was no different. It contained many references to past entries, but one in particular stood out to fans of Final Fantasy VII more than others, the inclusion of a character named Shinra. More than just a passing reference to Final Fantasy VII's infamous electric power company, the character of Shinra even had dialogue pertaining to using the Farplane, Shinra's afterlife, as a source of energy. According to the scenario writer Kazushika Nojima, who was talking in the X-2 Ultimania about the hypothetical future of certain characters, he liked to believe that after the events of X-2, Shinra quit the Gullwings and with the help of Rin, developed a way to extract Mako energy from the Farplane. The Shinra Electric Power Company of Final Fantasy VII was then formed more than 1,000 years later, once travel to distant planets was possible, at least in Nojima's mind. Though this is not necessarily canon, Square did continue to have fun connecting the two games, as with the release of the Final Fantasy VII Remake, the figure of Shinra from X-2 was featured in a photograph of the founders of the Shinra Company, leading many to speculate how deep this connection actually ran, but this too was just meant as a fun nod, as opposed to being a serious piece of lore. Most of this though is pretty well known however, but what's not so well known is that X-2 featured a multitude of additional references to Final Fantasy VII that tended to slide under the radar. For example, when entering the Bevelle Underground for the first time, the camera panned behind Yuna in a very specific way, and this was intentional. As revealed by Daisuke Watanabe in the same Ultimania interview with Nojima, this was done to replicate the opening cinematic from Final Fantasy VII when the camera pinned out from Midgar. In addition, the boss of the Mi'ihen High Road Fiend Colony, King Vermin, was named after a favourite insult of Barrett's for President Shinra, complete with the enemy's bestiary being written in a manner similar to Barrett's speech pattern. There was even an overt reference to Aerith's limit break, Healing Wind, through the garment grid of the same name, not to mention the method of finding, catching, and raising chocobos appearing to be directly influenced by 7's famous side quest and minigame. So while it's hard to say definitively that the world of Spirit is connected to the world from Final Fantasy VII through interplanetary travel, it's very clear the games were connected via some clever development Easter eggs and allusions. When you think about Final Fantasy soundtracks, it's hard not to instantly think about the myriad of iconic and definitive pieces created by longtime series composer Nobuo Uematsu. Being the sole or primary composer for many mainline entries in the series throughout the golden era of the 90s JRPGs, he often single-handedly created the soundtracks to so many iconic moments that remain famous to this day. By the time Final Fantasy X was in development, however, the writing was on the wall that Uematsu had begun to step back from his prominent role in the series. Fully intending for Final Fantasy IX to be his magnum opus score for the franchise, it was after this achievement that he started to find the volume of work required too much, as not only was there an expectation to compose soundtracks, he was also being asked to oversee the production of others. Across 2000 and 2001, when including personal projects, arrangement albums, compilation albums, and traditional compositional duties, it meant Uematsu would end up having credits on 28 separate albums, including the likes of Final Fantasy 9 and 10, the latter of which he would end up co-composing with Masashi Hamauzu and Junya Nakano, the Are My Goddess, the movie soundtrack, for which he composed the main theme, and the soundtrack for Final Fantasy Unlimited, which was co-composed by Shiro Hamaguchi and Akifumi Tada, with Uematsu also working on Final Fantasy XI alongside Naoshi Mizuta and Kumi Tanioka, while serving as the executive producer on soundtracks such as Vagrant Story and The Bouncer. It was a lot to take on, and it meant Motomo Toriyama and Yoshinori Kitase had a tough decision to make. They had wanted to have Uematsu work on the Ten-2 soundtrack, if only for posterity, and they approached him about doing so, but due to the busy schedule, he would end up having to decline. Enter Noriko Matsuda and Takehito Eguchi. The pair had met when working on the game called Bahamut Lagoon, the first project Toriyama had worked on after joining Square. They would then co-compose its pseudo-sequel Racing Lagoon before reuniting on The Bouncer, which was of course overseen by Uematsu. Their work would end up being a huge departure from the music of Final Fantasy X, with none of the pieces from the original soundtrack reused. And it meant that even though Final Fantasy X-2 wasn't the first game in the franchise to have music composed by someone that wasn't Uematsu, it was the first mainline game to receive the honour, even if that hadn't been the initial plan. It's no secret that for Square, mainline Final Fantasy games are big budget affairs, with each new release frequently pushing the envelope for not only this series, but video games as a whole. To that end, each new entry in the series saw its development teams grow and grow, with the budgets often residing within the tens of millions during the PlayStation era. But even though it would have made sense for Ten-2 to follow suit, pushing things even further, Square was suffering from severe financial pressures around that time, and they had to make sure the game was as profitable as possible. It saw them cut the size of the development team by almost 66%, but due to the fact that there was a significant staff overlap between the two games, this small development team were already familiar with the world of Spira, its characters, and more importantly, the assets from the original game. Reusing the vast majority of assets from a previous Final Fantasy game had not really ever been done before prior to Ten-2, but the approach not only meant the team could be much leaner, they could also develop the game much faster, and it meant Ten-2 went from conception to finished product well inside 2 years. Of course, the reusing of assets did lead to some humorous moments in-game, with one infamous example being Lulu using the same in-game model despite supposedly having been 9 months pregnant, something that was actually referenced in-game and then promptly lampshaded by Riku. Overall, it meant the reused assets were a double-edged sword, as although they let Square and the development team finish the game much faster and in a much more cost-effective manner, it ultimately led to some players and critics noting that the game felt less polished than its predecessor, especially considering its more fragmented playstyle. And that brings us on to our final fact, that Ten-2 almost wasn't called Ten-2 at all. Naming conventions for mainline Final Fantasy games follow a pretty specific guideline, but as the first sequel to a mainline game, it was difficult for Kitase and his team to decide what to call the new project. Similar to the dilemma faced by the team working on Final Fantasy XI, who for a long time toyed with calling it something else such as Final Fantasy Online, there were discussions about the sequel to Final Fantasy X being the next numbered game, and as Final Fantasy XII had already been in planning well before there was even a whiff that 10 might have a sequel, this meant that the original name for Final Fantasy X-2 was probably Final Fantasy XIII. But it didn't seem like the right move for the series or the story they wanted to tell with the sequel, especially as they had finally got over the unconventional naming issues that had arisen during the 16-bit era of the franchise in North America. So they looked at other precedents for how they had treated spin-off stories in the past, as they would often be titled in such a way that they would be clearly differentiated from the main numbered series, such as Final Fantasy Tactics or Mystic Quest. There was also how they handled the semi-sequel to Final Fantasy V, an OVA that ended up being called Final Fantasy Legend of the Crystals. For a direct sequel, however, Kitase and the team decided that definitively tying the new game to its predecessor made the most sense, and they ultimately pushed for that direction, ditching the notion of it being called Final Fantasy XIII, with Kitase proposing Final Fantasy X-2 to the board. But what's interesting is that the board rejected the name. They were concerned that the game would be confused as Final Fantasy XII due to the mixing of Roman numerals and modern-day Latin digits, especially amongst Western consumers. This must have been very frustrating, and much like Hiromichi Tanaka did not relent with the naming of Final Fantasy XI, Kitase did not relent about Final Fantasy X-2, ultimately convincing the powers that be that X-2 was the right title to go with, although he probably was helped by the constant delays that Final Fantasy XII was itself suffering. The decision to use this naming convention would then be used by Kitase in the future with Final Fantasy XIII. But even that wasn't set in stone from the beginning, as Final Fantasy XIII-2 was initially going to be called Final Fantasy XIII Season 2, and the third title was going to be called Final Fantasy XIII-3 before it was changed at the last minute to be revealed as Lightning Returns, as they felt that calling it XIII-3 would be far too prohibitive for new players. And with that, I think we're done. There were 7 facts about Final Fantasy X-2 you probably didn't know, but I'm still sure there are some amongst you who knew them all. Let us know in the comments below which fact you found to be the most interesting, and if you enjoyed the video, please give us a like and be sure to subscribe to the channel. Alright everyone, with that, this is Daryl signing out. I'd like to give a big thank you to all of our Patreon and YouTube membership supporters, especially Benjamin Snow, The Livestream, Gregory, Lord of Morning, and Z-Dawn, who are super special Onion supporters, and of course a big thank you to everyone for watching this video. I'll see you all again soon for more Final Fantasy goodness.